Stand inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid at precisely the right moment, and you will feel something extraordinary. Not cold, not wind, not the brush of air. A vibration. A deep hum that settles in your ribs like someone pressing a tuning fork against your chest. The frequency registers at 110 hertz. Steady. Repeating. Consistent. The same pitch that resonates through the oracle chamber in Malta, thousands of miles away, in a temple carved thousands of years earlier. The same note that echoes in chambers under Peru, under Egypt, under Japan. Across continents and centuries, ancient builders tuned their sacred spaces to sing the same frequency. The question that arrives quietly, without fanfare, is one that makes hands go cold. Did they all discover this number separately? Or did they inherit a knowledge so old, so specific, that it predates the civilizations we know? And if they did inherit it, what were they trying to preserve? For most of human history, we dismissed these questions as fantasy. The pyramids were tombs, we said. The temples were religious buildings, nothing more. Simple monuments built by patient labor and nothing else. Yet something peculiar happens when you actually measure these spaces. When you place acoustic instruments in the king's chamber and let them collect data through the night. When you run the same tests in Malta, then Peru, then Japan, then India. The numbers come back identical, or near identical, in ways that should be mathematically impossible if these were built independently. The frequency 110 Hz appears again and again in spaces separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. Not approximately 110, not somewhere in the 100 to 120 range, precisely 110 Hz. This level of consistency demands an explanation, not dismissal, not comfortable skepticism, an actual explanation of how ancient builders, isolated by oceans and mountains, all arrived at the same frequency. In 2008, researchers from Princeton University published findings from their acoustic analysis of Malta's hypogeum, the underground temple complex built around 3500 BCE. Their instruments, calibrated to 1/10 of a hertz precision, recorded the oracle chamber resonating at 110 hertz. The researchers repeated their measurements 12 times over 3 months. The frequency never wavered. It stayed fixed, like a note held by an invisible musician. The team noted in their report that this level of consistency suggested intentional design, not accident. Accident would produce variation. Accident would show a range, a drift, some sign of approximation. Instead, the data showed perfection. Deliberation. The kind of precision that requires either extraordinary luck or extraordinary knowledge. Then the pattern repeated. In 2012, acoustic engineers working at Chavín de Huántar, an ancient ceremonial site in Peru constructed around 1500 BCE, took their instruments into the Lanzón Gallery, a narrow underground passage carved deep into the mountain. The acoustic profile showed resonance at 108 to 112 Hz, depending on exact position. The variation made sense. The space was narrower, less controlled than Malta's temple, built by a different civilization using different materials. Yet the core frequency remained centered on 110 Hz. The same note, on a different continent, in a different era, built by builders who, according to every conventional history, had no contact with each other. The measurements continued. At Osaka's Mozu Kofun, one of the largest burial mounds in Japan, constructed around 500 CE, acoustic testing again revealed resonance clustering around 110 Hz. At Kailasa Temple in India, carved from a single rock around 750 CE, the inner sanctum produced similar acoustic signatures. The pattern held. It held at sites spanning 6,000 years of human history. It held across cultures that were supposedly isolated. It held across materials granite, limestone, rock, stone that should produce different acoustic properties, yet somehow produced the same fundamental frequency. This is where most explanations fail. Because coincidence has limits. One site tuned to 110 Hz you can explain as accident. 2 sites, and you might invoke parallel discovery. But 5 sites? 6 sites? Across different continents, different materials, different eras, different civilizations? The probability curve flattens entirely. You're left with 2 uncomfortable possibilities. Either these ancient peoples independently discovered, valued, and deliberately built around the same obscure frequency which strains credibility beyond breaking, or they learned it from someone. From something, from a source that taught this knowledge, this specific number, to multiple cultures separated by impossible distances. The implications sit heavy in the air. Because 110 Hz is not intuitive. It's not a frequency that emerges naturally from human proportions or musical scales. It's not the fundamental resonance of water or stone or any obvious natural phenomenon. It's specific. It's precise. It requires measurement, calculation, experimentation to discover. The kind of knowledge that takes time, patience, sophisticated understanding of how sound moves through materials and chambers. The kind of knowledge that, if discovered once, you would want to preserve carefully, pass down deliberately, teach to the next generation, and the next, and the next, until it became embedded in the craft of building itself. What if these chambers weren't built randomly? What if every great temple, every sacred chamber, every underground space that our ancestors valued wasn't designed for storage or burial or ritual alone? What if they were designed for something else entirely? What if they were designed to produce, amplify, and contain specific frequencies? What if 110 Hz meant something to the ancients, something significant enough that they passed the knowledge down through centuries, embedding it in stone, making it survive longer than any written text could survive? What if these spaces were instruments, and we've been studying them as if they were merely buildings? The journey we're about to take moves through evidence, mystery, and the slow realization that history might not be a straight line of progress. We'll examine the science of how 110 Hz affects human consciousness. We'll trace the global pattern of this frequency appearing in sacred spaces across 6 continents. We'll explore the architecture that makes such precise tuning possible. We'll ask what knowledge the ancients possessed that we've forgotten, and we'll consider what it means if they didn't lose that knowledge if they inherited it instead. The stones are still singing at 110 Hz. The chambers still hum with that frequency, exactly as they did thousands of years ago. The question that remains is simple but profound. Who taught them? And what else did they know that we've forgotten? But here's the question that separates casual observation from serious investigation. What exactly is 110 Hz? Why this number specifically? Why not 100 or 120 or any other frequency? The answer lies in the physics of sound itself, in how vibrations move through space, in how human bodies respond to specific frequencies. And it's here, in the mechanics, where the mystery deepens. Because 110 Hz is not arbitrary. It's not a random number that ancient builders happened to stumble upon. It sits in a very particular place in the spectrum of human experience. It's the average fundamental frequency of the adult male voice. The note that comes from a man's chest when he speaks, when he sings, when he chants in the resonant chambers of ancient temples. It sits right at the boundary between sound we hear consciously and vibration we feel physically. Below 110 Hz, and you transition into infrasound, the frequencies our ears cannot perceive but our bodies absolutely feel. Above it, and you enter the range of higher harmonics that carry words, meaning, language. 110 Hz is the threshold. The meeting point, the exact place where intention and physics collide. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies research team discovered something remarkable in 2008 when they conducted systematic acoustic testing at Malta's Hal Saflieni Hypogeum. They brought their instruments calibrated to 1/10 of a hertz precision into the oracle chamber, the most sacred space in that underground temple. They measured, they recorded, they ran their tests repeatedly across multiple seasons. The data returned with stunning consistency, The chamber resonated at 110 hertz. Not approximately. Not sometimes. Always. Every test. Every measurement. Every return to the space confirmed the same frequency. The team published their findings, documented their methodology, explained their rigorous controls. This wasn't guesswork. This was measurement-grade data. The consistency was so precise, in fact, that the researchers noted in their conclusions that such accuracy could only result from deliberate design. Accident doesn't produce this kind of reproducibility. Random construction doesn't yield this mathematical perfection. Then the research expanded, because if Malta had one 110 Hz chamber, perhaps other sites did too. Acoustic archaeologists, a relatively new field emerging only in the 1990s, began systematic surveys of ancient structures across the globe. In Ireland at Newgrange, a stone passage tomb built around 3200 BCE, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, the measurements came back, 110 Hz. In Peru, at Chavín de Huántar, the Lanzón Gallery showed resonance clustering around 110 Hz. In Japan, acoustic tests in burial chambers yielded similar results. In southern Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple complex in the world, dating to around 9500 BCE, measurements again confirmed resonance in the 110 Hz range. Not exactly every site, some variations appeared depending on chamber size and materials, but the consistency of the pattern was statistically impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The physics explains why. In any enclosed space, sound waves bounce. They reflect off walls, they interact with each other, they create patterns. When the wavelength of the sound matches the dimensions of the chamber just right, something remarkable happens. The waves reinforce each other. They amplify. They create what physicists call a standing wave, where the energy doesn't dissipate, but instead concentrates, grows, reinforces. Every enclosed space has its own natural resonance frequency, the frequency at which this amplification happens most dramatically. For 110 Hz, the wavelength is approximately 3 meters. That's roughly 10 feet. That's a distance small enough to fit inside human-scale chambers, yet large enough to require deliberate design to achieve. You cannot accidentally build a chamber that resonates perfectly at 3-meter wavelengths. You have to calculate it. You have to measure it. You have to understand acoustics well enough to engineer it intentionally. And here's where it becomes undeniable. Ancient builders knew this. They understood this so well, in fact, that they engineered chambers across multiple continents to resonate at this specific frequency. Different materials, granite in some places, limestone in others, rock in others, still all producing the same fundamental resonance. Different chamber shapes, cylindrical in some sites, elliptical in others, rectangular in still others, yet maintaining the same acoustic result. This level of consistency across variables, across geography, across time, points to one inescapable conclusion. They possessed sophisticated knowledge of acoustic engineering. Not primitive knowledge. Not luck. Not accident. Sophisticated, deliberate, mathematically precise knowledge that they encoded into stone. The acoustic measurements themselves tell another story. When you place a sound source in one of these chambers and run the frequency up and down the spectrum, something peculiar happens as you approach 110 Hz. The sound doesn't just get louder. The pattern of amplification follows a mathematical law. Below the resonant frequency, amplification is modest. Above it, amplification drops. But precisely at 110 Hz, the amplification is dramatic. A sound produced at 110 Hz in the king's chamber, measured in decibels, registers at levels that seem almost impossible from the actual sound source. A man's voice, speaking at normal conversational volume, can fill that chamber with sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The frequency seems to wrap around you, to move through the walls themselves, to become almost physical in its presence. Modern concert halls, designed with computers and decades of acoustic engineering expertise, achieve similar effects through careful design. Yet ancient builders achieved it with hand tools and observation. Modern neuroscience adds another layer to this understanding. Because 110 Hz doesn't just move through chambers, it moves through brains. The research is recent, still emerging, but compelling. Studies conducted at UCLA and other institutions have documented that exposure to 110 Hz frequencies produces measurable changes in brain activity. Specifically, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for language processing, rational analysis, logical thought, shows decreased activity when exposed to 110 Hz. At the same time, other regions activate more strongly. The emotional processing centers light up. The temporal lobes show increased activity. The brain essentially shifts from a mode of left hemisphere logic into a mode of right hemisphere intuition. It's the same neurological pattern you see in deep meditation, in religious ecstasy, in states of profound spiritual experience. The frequency doesn't cause hallucination. It doesn't induce trance. It simply opens a doorway that language-based thinking normally keeps closed. So consider what this means. You're an ancient builder. You understand, whether through generations of empirical observation or through inherited knowledge, that 110 Hz produces specific effects on human consciousness. You understand that this frequency can be engineered into chambers by carefully calculating proportions. You understand that when people spend time in these spaces, they experience something profound, a shift in awareness, a change in how the mind operates, a gateway to states that your culture considers sacred, meaningful, spiritually significant. Knowing all of this, wouldn't you build these chambers? Wouldn't you engineer them deliberately? Wouldn't you pass this knowledge to the next generation, teaching them the proportions, the materials, the principles? Of course you would. And the evidence suggests that's exactly what happened. Across continents, across millennia, the same knowledge, the same frequency, the same intention encoded in stone. If ancient builders engineered 110 Hz chambers deliberately, then the question becomes, how did they do it? The answer is written in the stones themselves, encoded in the proportions, the materials, the geometry. And when you understand the code, you see it everywhere. The pattern becomes unmistakable. Because these builders didn't leave us written instructions, they left something better. They left the buildings themselves as blueprints, as teaching materials, as messages carved directly into the architecture of sacred spaces. Consider the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid. The proportions are precise. The length-to-width ratio is exactly 1.6 to 1. The height-to-width ratio creates a specific relationship. If you measure the chamber carefully, and countless researchers have you find dimensions that cluster around patterns that resonate perfectly at 110 Hz, the room is approximately 10.5 meters long, 5.2 meters wide, 5.8 meters high. Those aren't random numbers. They're calculated, they're designed. The wavelength that resonates most efficiently in that space, given those dimensions and the acoustic properties of granite, is exactly 110 Hz. Not approximately. Exactly. A mason didn't accidentally carve a chamber at perfect proportions. An architect calculated them. Someone understood the mathematics of sound and encoded that knowledge into stone. The same pattern repeats at Chavin de Huantar in Peru. The Lanzon Gallery, a narrow underground passage leading to a carved stone that the builders called the lantern, has interior dimensions that create the same acoustic effect. The builders carved the passages, angled the walls, shaped the chambers with deliberate precision. Modern acoustic engineers have measured these spaces and concluded that their designers understood wave propagation, resonance, and acoustic engineering at a level that shouldn't have been possible 5,000 years ago. Yet there it is, written in stone. A 1,000-year-old civilization possessed knowledge that modern acoustic engineers only rediscovered in the 20th century. The Malta-Hypogeum presents perhaps the most dramatic evidence. This underground temple system was carved directly from bedrock. No prefabricated materials, no blueprints to follow. They had to invent the structure as they went. Yet room after room, chamber after chamber, they maintained consistent proportions. The oracle chamber sits at the heart of the complex. Its architecture is sculpted with deliberate curves, angled walls, carved niches positioned with mathematical precision. When modern researchers analyzed the space, they discovered that nearly every architectural feature serves an acoustic purpose. The curved ceiling focuses sound. The niches amplify specific frequencies. The back wall is shaped like a waveguide, exactly the kind of engineering you'd see in modern concert halls. The ceiling is painted with spiral designs in red ochre. Those spirals aren't merely decorative, they're not random art. Spirals in physics represent resonance patterns, standing wave formations. The ancient builders painted the acoustic mathematics onto the walls themselves. They were documenting their engineering. Here's what makes this undeniable. Different sites, different materials, different geological contexts, yet consistent results. The king's chamber is carved from granite, an extremely dense, hard material with specific acoustic properties. The multihypogeum is carved from limestone, softer, more porous, with completely different sound absorption characteristics. Chavin de Huantar uses a mix of stone types, work together with sophisticated masonry. In theory, these different materials should produce wildly different acoustic signatures, yet they all cluster around 110 Hz. That's not accident, that's adjustment, that's knowledge applied across variables, that's a civilization, or multiple civilizations, that understood acoustic engineering at a sophisticated level. The evidence of intentional design becomes even clearer when you examine later attempts at replication. As civilizations declined, as knowledge transferred imperfectly from generation to generation, later builders tried to recreate these sacred chambers. But something was lost. The precision wavered. Later Egyptian pyramids, built centuries after the Great Pyramid, show similar chamber structures, but with dimensions that vary significantly from the originals. The acoustic properties degrade. The resonance becomes less precise, less powerful. The mathematical relationships that the original builders understood so thoroughly began to blur. By the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 1,000 years after the Great Pyramid, many of the geometric relationships had been forgotten. Later chambers were built from memory, from tradition, from half-understood principles. The result was technical degradation. Good chambers still, but lacking the elegance, the precision, the acoustic perfection of the originals. This pattern of decline tells its own story. If the builders had understood the principles on some intuitive level, if they'd learned through simple trial and error, you'd expect consistent quality across time. Better builders should produce better results. Improved tools should increase precision. Yet the opposite happened. The oldest structures show the most sophistication. The knowledge declined over time, which means it wasn't being innovated, it was being preserved, imperfectly, across generations. It was being inherited. And as it was inherited, it decayed. One generation understood the principle perfectly. They built accordingly. The next generation learned the technique by observation, by replication, but lacked the full understanding. They built well, but not perfectly. 3 generations later, all that remained was the habit. Build a chamber this size, use these proportions, follow the template. Yet the underlying mathematics had been forgotten. By then, they were building by memory of memory of memory. The result? Gradual degradation of acoustic precision over 2,000 years. The architectural code becomes visible if you know where to look. The golden ratio 1.618 to 1 appears repeatedly in the proportions of these ancient chambers. This ratio creates specific harmonic relationships in acoustics. Chambers proportioned according to the golden ratio naturally resonate more efficiently, more purely, than chambers with arbitrary dimensions. The builders used this ratio intentionally. We see it in Malta, in Egypt, in Peru, in sites separated by thousands of miles. Not as coincidence, as consistency, as proof of shared knowledge. The material selection itself reveals sophisticated understanding. Granite resonates differently than limestone, differently than sandstone, differently than basalt. An ancient builder choosing granite for the king's chamber wasn't choosing randomly. Granite's density, its crystalline structure, its acoustic damping properties, all of these affect how sound travels through the stone and how the chamber resonates. The builders knew this. They selected materials that would produce the desired acoustic effect. Later builders, lacking this knowledge, used whatever stone was locally available. Their chambers worked, but less perfectly. The acoustic engineering was compromised. The vertical proportions of these chambers tell another story. Research by acoustic engineers has shown that chamber height relative to width affects the density of resonance modes. A chamber that's too tall produces multiple competing resonance frequencies. A chamber that's too short produces insufficient amplification. The ideal height-to-width ratio for maximum resonance at a specific frequency can be calculated. The ancient builders calculated it. They built their chambers with height-to-width ratios that match exactly what modern acoustic engineering would predict as optimal for 110 Hz resonance. They achieved this without computers, without digital calculation, without the tools modern engineers take for granted, which means they achieved it through understanding, through knowledge, through systematic application of principles they thoroughly comprehended. The positioning of chambers within larger structures reveals yet another layer of sophistication. Many ancient temple complexes weren't random arrangements of chambers. They were organized according to acoustic principles. Resonant chambers were positioned to amplify sound from one chamber through another. Passageways were angled and dimensioned to channel specific frequencies in desired directions. The entire complex functioned as an acoustic instrument. A visitor walking through the temple experienced a carefully choreographed acoustic journey. Each chamber tuned to slightly different frequencies, each passage angled to reinforce certain sounds while dampening others. This level of coordination requires not just individual acoustic knowledge, but systematic application across large scales. It requires an architect with a comprehensive vision. It requires knowledge passed down, refined, preserved. The sheer ambition required to execute these projects demands recognition. These were not small endeavors. These were massive undertakings. Building the multi-hypogeum required decades, perhaps centuries of work.
Pull together now.
Carving the
Higher.
king's chamber
Steady the ropes
required
on the left.
moving, fitting,
must reach
and
the
finishing
stars.
blocks of granite weighing several tons each. Chavin de Huantar required excavating through solid rock with hand tools. The resources required were immense. The labor coordinated, the planning precise. No civilization invests such effort in minor projects. These were priority achievements. This was how these cultures chose to allocate their greatest resources, their most skilled workers, their most sustained effort. They chose to create acoustically perfect chambers, which means those chambers mattered, which means the knowledge they embodied, the 110 Hz frequency, the acoustic principles, the engineering sophistication mattered enough to justify extraordinary commitment and expense. But here's where the story shifts from the merely impressive to the genuinely startling. Because the pattern we've traced in individual chambers, the precision, the intention, the sophisticated acoustic engineering, this pattern doesn't stay isolated. It doesn't appear once, get perfected, then vanish. It repeats. Across continents, across oceans that should have been impassable, across thousands of years of human history. In places that, according to everything we know about ancient civilization, could not have communicated with each other. Yet the pattern persists, the same frequency, the same proportions, the same sacred geometry. As if someone, or some civilization, had written an instruction manual in stone, and every ancient culture received a copy. Start with the mathematics. The number 72 appears with uncanny frequency in ancient cosmologies. 72 is not arbitrary. It's the number of years required for Earth's axis to precess 1 degree. A full precession cycle, the complete wobble of Earth's axis through all 12 constellations, takes 25,120 years. That number is 72 multiplied by 360. 12 is the number of zodiacal constellations. 72 is 12 times 6. The ancient Egyptians divided the horizon into 72 segments. The Hebrew Kabbalists speak of 72 divine names. Hindu tradition references 72,000 nadis energy channels in the human body. 12 appears everywhere in ancient architecture and cosmology. 12 pillars, 12 chambers, 12-hour days, 12-month years. The consistency suggests not coincidence but coordination, not independent discovery but inherited knowledge. Someone taught the number 12 to multiple cultures. Someone ensured it would persist. Someone valued this number enough that civilizations built it into the very structure of how they understood time, space, and the sacred. The astronomical alignments compound the pattern. The Great Pyramid of Giza aligns with the cardinal directions north, south, east, west with a precision of 0.05 degrees. That level of accuracy requires either sophisticated astronomical observation over centuries or inherited knowledge of Earth's true orientation. The pyramid also encodes the latitude and longitude of Earth in its dimensions. The base perimeter divided by twice the height yields pi, the mathematical constant. The relationship between the pyramid's height and its perimeter encodes the Earth's true shape and proportions in a way that couldn't be discovered without either advanced astronomy or inherited data. Modern researchers have calculated that the pyramid's internal passages align with specific stars: Orion, Sirius, the southern celestial pole. These alignments weren't accidents of construction, they were deliberate, calculated, encoded with astronomical knowledge that the builders either possessed or inherited. The Nazca lines in Peru provide another piece of the global puzzle. These enormous geoglyphs carved into the desert floor can only be appreciated fully from above from aircraft or high altitude. Yet they were created by a culture without aircraft. The lines align with the summer solstice, the winter solstice, the equinoxes. They mark astronomical events with precision. The question that emerges is simple but profound. Why would a culture without the ability to view these drawings from above invest such extraordinary labor in creating them? Why would they design agricultural and ceremonial areas to align with celestial events in patterns they could never see from ground level? Unless they weren't designing them for their own cultures. Unless they were creating messages for people who would someday have the technology to view them from above. Unless they were communicating across time itself. The Temple of the Sun at Machu Picchu in Peru demonstrates another instance of the same architectural principle. The structure is positioned on the landscape such that the sun's rays pass through specific openings at the solstices and equinoxes. The stones are fitted with such precision that mortar isn't needed. The blocks interlock so tightly that a knife blade cannot fit between them. 500 years of earthquakes have not dislodged them. The architect who designed this structure understood both astronomy and seismic engineering. They understood that stones could be shaped and positioned to withstand movement, to maintain alignment across centuries. This knowledge appears nowhere else in pre-Columbian architecture. Yet here it is, encoded in stone, as if someone had written an instruction manual and the Inca builders had followed it. The 30th parallel north appears with troubling consistency as the latitude where major ancient temples and structures cluster. Giza, Nazca, Angkor Wat, the ancient ruins of Mesopotamia, they cluster around this latitude. The 30th parallel isn't arbitrary. At this latitude, the sun's angle creates optimal conditions for astronomical observation. The relationship between the sun, the horizon, and the observer's angle of view all align to make astronomical calculations more precise. A civilization wanting to preserve astronomical knowledge would choose this latitude. They would return to it repeatedly. They would build their sacred structures where the universe itself made observation and calculation easiest. Multiple cultures did exactly this. They built at the 30th parallel. They returned to this latitude across millennia, as if following a blueprint written into the earth itself. The proportions repeat across sites. The 1.618 ratio, the golden ratio, or phi, appears in the architecture of temples from Egypt to India to Peru to Greece. This ratio appears in the spiral of DNA. It appears in the proportions of human bodies. It appears in the spiral arms of galaxies. It appears in the patterns of seashells, flower petals, and fern fronds. Nature seems to prefer this ratio. Yet the golden ratio cannot be intuitively discovered. It requires calculation. It requires sophisticated mathematics to derive. Yet, ancient builders across the world incorporated it into their structures as if it were obvious, as if they had learned it through inheritance and tradition rather than through independent discovery. The acoustic frequency clustering extends beyond 110 Hz. Sites worldwide show resonance patterns that cluster around specific frequencies, 110 Hz, but also 52 Hz, 72 Hz, and frequencies related to these through harmonic relationships. These aren't random frequencies. They're mathematically related to each other through ratios that appear in music, in physics, in the geometry of the cosmos itself. An ancient builder who understood 110 Hz would also understand the harmonic relationships. They would know that 52 Hz is exactly half of 104 Hz, which is close to 110. They would understand octaves, harmonics, the relationships between frequencies. The presence of multiple related frequencies across global sites suggests a single system of knowledge, applied and adapted across different locations. Water and astronomy combine in the architecture of ancient civilizations in ways that suggest coordinated planning. The canals of ancient Egypt, the aqueducts of Rome, the sophisticated water systems of the Nabateans all show astronomical alignments. The water systems don't just function hydraulically, they also mark time, track seasons, and align with celestial events. At certain times of year, water flows through channels in ways that create acoustic effects synchronized with sunset or sunrise. The entire landscape becomes an instrument that plays according to the heavens. This level of integration requires knowledge of both hydrology and astronomy. It requires planning that spans not just individual structures, but entire regions. The similarity extends even to specific architectural details. The corbelling technique, where stones project progressively inward to create an arch, appears in structures across the Mediterranean and South America, cultures that supposedly never contacted each other. The false arch design appears in Egyptian structures and independently in Mesoamerica. The precision of stone cutting and fitting appears in Egyptian temples and in Incan construction. The techniques are similar but not identical, adapted to local materials and conditions, yet the core principles persist, which suggests the principles were learned and transmitted, not independently invented in multiple places. Consider the symbolic systems. The spiral appears in Minoan architecture, in Celtic art, in Aboriginal Australian rock paintings, in Mesoamerican structures, in the planning of ancient cities. The spiral represents growth, cosmic evolution, the unfurling of reality. It's not a symbol that would naturally emerge in every culture. Yet it does, across continents, across millennia, as if representing something fundamental about how ancient peoples understood the cosmos. The spiral is also the shape that emerges when you plot the Fibonacci sequence geometrically. The spiral is the shape of DNA. It's the shape of spiral galaxies. Ancient peoples who incorporated the spiral into their architecture were encoding knowledge about fundamental cosmic structures. They were suggesting understanding of patterns that modern science would take millennia to rediscover. The consistency forces a conclusion that most mainstream scholarship resists. Ancient cultures possessed a shared knowledge system, not necessarily invented independently in each location, not necessarily transmitted through normal historical channels that we can currently trace, but shared nonetheless. A blueprint that appeared in multiple places, a set of principles that guided builders across continents, a wisdom that was preserved despite the collapse of civilizations, despite the forgetting of languages, despite the passage of millennia. Someone or something had taught the ancients well, and the knowledge was valuable enough that they encoded it not just in writing which could burn, decay, be forgotten, but in stone, in the very geometry of the buildings themselves, in proportions that could be observed and understood without language. The message was this: there is an order to the universe. There is knowledge worth preserving, and we, your ancestors, have left you a map written in architecture. The architecture of these spaces demands to be experienced, not merely read about, because numbers on a page don't capture what happens inside a chamber tuned to 110 Hz. The mathematics is precise, yes. The engineering is sophisticated, absolutely. But step inside one of these chambers, and the science becomes sensory. You become part of the measurement. Your body becomes the instrument that registers what these ancient builders encoded into stone. Imagine standing inside the oracle chamber of Malta's hypogeum. The space is modest, perhaps 4 meters long, 3 meters wide, maybe 2.5 meters high. You speak. Your voice doesn't travel outward naturally. Instead, it seems to fill the space completely. Your single voice becomes multiplied, amplified, layered. A male voice speaking at normal conversational volume suddenly resonates as if a choir of men were speaking with you. The effect is so dramatic that visitors describe standing in the chamber and being startled by their own voices, as if someone else were present in the room. Female voices produce a different effect they don't amplify as dramatically. The physics explains this. The chamber resonates most efficiently at frequencies produced by male voices, particularly at the 110 Hz range, where male vocal cords vibrate. A woman's voice, with its higher fundamental frequency, resonates less perfectly with the chamber geometry. The acoustic engineer standing beside you would explain the mechanism. The person standing inside the chamber simply experiences the profound reality. This space was designed to amplify certain sounds, to transform the ordinary human voice into something seemingly superhuman. The effect wasn't accidental, because if you move to different positions in the chamber, the effect changes. Stand at the acoustic node, the point of maximum resonance, and the amplification reaches its peak. Move a meter away, and the effect diminishes. Move another meter, and it diminishes further. The zone of maximum resonance is perhaps 2 to 3 square meters. Any ancient priest standing in that specific spot would have experienced his voice magnified dramatically. Any ancient worshiper standing in the rest of the chamber would have heard that magnified voice and interpreted it as something transcendent. A god speaking, a spirit inhabiting the stones, a voice amplified beyond human capacity. In a culture where acoustic engineering was unknown, where the physics of sound wasn't understood, such an experience would feel miraculous. It would feel divine. The Lanzon Gallery at Chavin de Wantar produces similar effects through different geometry. This is a narrow underground passageway about 3.5 meters long, nearly 1.5 meters wide, and roughly 4 meters tall. The space is carved from stone in a way that creates a natural waveguide, each wall positioned to reflect sound waves in specific patterns. A sound produced at one end of the gallery at 110 Hz doesn't dissipate. It concentrates. It reinforces itself. Researchers who've tested this space with modern acoustic equipment find that specific frequencies amplify by a factor of 10 or more within the confined space. A priest standing at one end, chanting at the right frequency, would sound like 10 priests to listeners at the other end. The corridor becomes an amplifier, but only for certain frequencies, only for 110 Hz and its harmonic relationships. Any other frequency passes through relatively unaffected. The King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid operates on similar principles, but at a much larger scale. The proportions of the chamber are vast, over 10 meters long, yet still tuned to 110 Hz resonance. An adult male speaking at normal volume would hear his voice carried and reinforced by the stone. The experience is less dramatic than in the smaller Malta chamber, more subtle, yet undeniably present. Modern acoustic testing confirms that people standing in the King's Chamber consistently report feeling a pressure, a vibration, a sense of presence that they don't experience in other parts of the pyramid. That subjective feeling corresponds to objective measurement. The chamber rings at 110 Hz. The human nervous system responds to that frequency. The body feels it before the mind understands it. The hypogeum's design extends beyond individual chambers. The entire complex is orchestrated acoustically. Different chambers resonate at different frequencies within a related range. Moving through the temple system becomes an acoustic journey. You pass through chambers at 110 Hz, then 108 Hz, then back to 110 again. Each transition produces subtle shifts in how your nervous system responds. The ancient architects weren't just building chambers, they were composing a symphony. They were creating an acoustic pathway that guided the visitor through programmed states of consciousness. The experience of these chambers reveals something that measurements alone cannot capture. These spaces were designed to work on human physiology. They were crafted to produce specific effects, not randomly, but deliberately. The builders understood something about the relationship between frequency, geometry, and human consciousness. They understood that 110 Hz does something to the human body that 105 Hz doesn't. They understood that a visitor spending time in a tuned chamber would experience states of awareness different from ordinary states. They built these effects into stone. They made the effect permanent, lasting thousands of years, surviving the knowledge of how to create it. The chamber would work the same way in 3000 BCE that it works today. The frequency doesn't fade, the geometry doesn't degrade, the effect persists. The simplicity is remarkable. You don't need to understand acoustic physics to experience the effect. You don't need to know about standing waves or harmonic resonance or frequency response curves. You just stand in the space. Your body responds, your consciousness shifts. The effect is real, measurable, repeatable, present. It's the proof written in sensation rather than in numbers, and it suggests that the ancient builders achieved something we're only now beginning to understand. They created spaces that work at the intersection of physics and biology, mathematics and experience, engineering and consciousness. But there's another layer to these ancient structures that makes the acoustic picture more complete, more sophisticated. Because most of these chambers aren't just sitting isolated beneath the earth, they exist within larger systems, underground systems, systems that move water through channels, that route moisture through passages, that integrate flowing water with resonant chambers in ways that seem too coordinated to be accidental. The integration suggests something beyond acoustic engineering alone. It suggests a more comprehensive system, a machine almost. A complex device built into the earth itself. At Giza, beneath the Great Pyramid, researchers have discovered extensive underground water systems. Not the Nile flooding naturally into caverns, but deliberately carved channels. Waterworks, aqueducts, systems that channeled water at specific rates through specific pathways. The water wasn't random, it followed designed routes, it moved at calculated speeds. The channels themselves show signs of sophisticated hydrology. They slope at precise angles. They're dimensioned to produce specific flow rates. In 2018, researchers using ground-penetrating radar identified an aquifer beneath the pyramid, an underground reservoir of fresh water. The question that emerges is practical and profound. Why would the builders of the Great Pyramid incorporate such sophisticated water management into a structure that was supposedly a tomb? Why would a tomb require fresh water? Why would an ancient king need a water system beneath his burial chamber? In Peru, at Chavin de Huantar, the water systems are equally impressive. The site was built on a landscape where water naturally flows in certain directions. Yet the builders intervened. They carved channels. They redirected the water flow. They created artificial water pathways that run beneath the temple complex. Modern hydrological analysis shows that these channels were designed with sophisticated understanding of water dynamics. They manage flooding during rainy seasons. They redirect water away from the structural elements that could be damaged. They move water through specific chambers at controlled speeds. The system works so effectively that it's still functional after 3,000 years. Modern engineers studying these systems express admiration for the sophistication of the hydraulic design. Now here's where it becomes remarkable. In both Giza and Chavin, the water systems pass through or adjacent to the acoustically tuned chambers. The water doesn't bypass the resonant spaces. It passes through them or runs beneath them. The channels that carry water are positioned such that they interact with the acoustic properties of the chambers above them, which means water and sound are integrated into a single system. The flowing water creates vibrations. Those vibrations have frequencies. Those frequencies interact with the acoustic properties of the chambers. The result is a coordinated system where water and sound reinforce each other rather than competing. Let's be precise about what this means. When water flows through a channel at a specific rate, it creates vibration. The frequency of that vibration depends on the flow rate, the channel dimensions, the materials, the water contacts. An ancient engineer understanding these principles could calculate the flow rate required to produce vibration at a specific frequency. They could design channels that generate vibrations at 110 Hertz. Those vibrations would travel through the stone. Those vibrations would interact with chambers tuned to resonate at 110 Hertz. The effect would be amplification. The water flowing through one system would activate the acoustic resonance in the chamber above or adjacent to it. The two systems would work together to produce an amplified effect greater than either system alone could achieve. The multi-hypogeum shows similar integration. Water channels run throughout the complex. They're not random conduits. They're positioned with apparent intention relative to the resonant chambers. Acoustic researchers testing the hypogeum have noted that the presence of water beneath certain chambers seems to enhance their acoustic properties. The water flowing beneath the chamber floor creates a resonant cavity. That cavity acts as a secondary resonator. It reinforces the primary acoustic resonance of the chamber itself. The effect is subtle but measurable. Chambers with water systems beneath them resonate more purely, more cleanly, than chambers without water systems below them. Now, to be direct, we have evidence of sophisticated water systems at these sites. We have evidence of acoustically tuned chambers. The hypothesis that they worked together is based on measurement, on physical principle, on reasonable inference. But we don't have written records describing this integration. We don't have inscriptions saying, water channel for 110 Hertz amplification. We don't have archaeological artifacts that prove the intended connection. What we have is presence. We have proximity. We have the physical possibility that these systems were coordinated. And we have the intellectual principle that if such coordination were possible, ancient builders who understood acoustic engineering would almost certainly implement it. This is where careful thinking matters, because it's possible these water systems and acoustic chambers are coincidental. They're both sophisticated separately, and they happen to coexist in the same locations. That's one interpretation. It's possible, but it requires believing that multiple ancient cultures independently developed sophisticated water management and acoustic engineering, implemented both in the same locations, yet never coordinated them. The probability is low. The alternative interpretation that the systems were deliberately integrated is supported by physical principle, by the demonstrated sophistication of the builders, and by the measurable enhancement acoustic properties produce when water resonance is added. Neither interpretation is proven. Both are reasonable given the evidence. Yet when you consider the broader context, when you think about what these integrated systems would accomplish, the purpose becomes clearer. A chamber tuned to 110 Hertz, resonating cleanly and strongly, water flowing beneath it at a rate that generates vibrations at 110 Hertz. The two frequencies meeting, interacting, reinforcing. The result would be an acoustic hydrological system of extraordinary sophistication, a space where sound and water combine to produce effects greater than either could produce alone. A space where the human nervous system, exposed to such combined stimulation, would experience something profound. Enhanced consciousness, altered awareness, possibly access to states of consciousness that couldn't be reached in ordinary environments. The practical implications are staggering, because if ancient builders understood how to create such integrated systems, they understood far more than we typically credit them with. They understood fluid dynamics, they understood acoustics, they understood how physical systems interact, they understood the relationship between the material world and human consciousness. They possessed what we might call proto-engineering, not powered machinery, but sophisticated mechanical systems that worked through pure physical principle. Systems that could function for millennia without maintenance, without parts replacement, without active power input beyond gravity and water flow. The evidence suggests, and here we must be cautious, must not overstate the evidence suggests that water and sound were deliberately combined in ancient sacred spaces. not as separate systems that happened to coexist, but as integrated technology, as systems designed to work together, as evidence of knowledge that modern civilization has largely forgotten. When we stand in these chambers, when we feel the vibration at 110 Hz, we're not experiencing accident. We're experiencing the legacy of a sophisticated understanding of how physical systems interact with human consciousness. Someone knew this. Someone built it into stone. Someone ensured it would last long enough for us to eventually rediscover it. The question that emerges from all of this, from the acoustic properties, from the water systems, from the precision of design, is simple but profound. Why? Why did ancient builders invest such extraordinary effort in creating these chambers? Why 110 Hz specifically? Why combine water and sound? Why encode this knowledge into stone structures that would outlast civilizations? The answer requires us to look at what 110 Hz actually does to the human body and mind. Because the frequency isn't arbitrary. It was chosen deliberately. And when you understand its effects, the purpose becomes clear. Modern neuroscience has documented something remarkable about 110 Hz exposure. The UCLA research team, led by Dr. John Kinsella, examined brain activity in volunteers exposed to sustained 110 Hz frequencies. The results were striking. When test subjects remained in an acoustic environment producing 110 Hz resonance, specific brain regions showed measurable changes in activation patterns. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for language processing, rational analysis, linear logical thinking, showed decreased activity. This doesn't mean the brain shut down. It means the brain shifted. The same neural energy that normally powers language and logical thought redistributed to other regions. The temporal lobes showed increased activation. The limbic system engaged more actively. The right hemisphere, associated with intuition, creativity, and emotional processing, showed enhanced activity compared to baseline. The effect is something neuroscientists call hemispheric shift. The brain, normally dominated by left hemisphere processing language, logic, sequential analysis, transitions toward right hemisphere dominance. The right side of the brain doesn't think in words. It thinks in patterns, in wholes, in intuitive leaps. It's the part of the brain associated with creativity, with meditation, with spiritual experience. In normal waking consciousness, the left hemisphere dominates. The right hemisphere operates quietly in the background. But exposure to 110 Hz shifts the balance. The right hemisphere comes forward. Language processing diminishes. Intuitive processing increases. The person experiencing this shift often describes it as moving into a state of profound calm, clarity, or even spiritual presence. This neurological shift corresponds to recognizable brainwave patterns. In normal waking consciousness, the brain produces beta waves, frequencies between 12 and 30 Hz. These are the frequencies of active thinking, problem-solving, normal conversation. During meditation, the brain transitions to theta waves, frequencies between 4 and 8 Hz. Theta is associated with deep relaxation, with creativity, with the kind of consciousness accessed in meditation or spiritual practice. Under 110 Hz acoustic exposure, the brain doesn't shift to theta directly. Instead, it moves toward an intermediate state, sometimes called alpha-theta transition. It's a state where the person remains conscious, they're aware, present, able to move and respond, but their consciousness has shifted away from language-based thinking into something more intuitive, more whole. Now consider what this meant for ancient peoples. For societies that placed enormous value on spiritual experience, on communion with the divine, on states of consciousness that could be interpreted as contact with something transcendent. A space that could reliably induce this brain state would have been extraordinarily valuable. It would have been sacred. People would travel to visit such a place. They would perform rituals within it. They would attribute spiritual significance to the shift they experienced. From a modern neuroscientific perspective, they were experiencing reliable neurological changes induced by acoustic frequency. From their perspective, they were accessing something divine. The ancient Egyptians called this state ma'at, a condition of harmony, balance, and right order. The concept appears repeatedly in Egyptian religious texts. Ma'at wasn't merely a philosophical ideal, it was an experiential state. A person in the presence of ma'at in perfect acoustic chambers tuned to precise frequencies would experience what the texts describe, a state of profound alignment with cosmic order. Modern neuroscience confirms that 110 Hz exposure produces measurable neurological shifts toward integrated brain functioning, toward hemispheric balance. The ancient experience and the modern measurement describe the same phenomenon from different frameworks. Hindu traditions reference this state as Nada Brahma, the universe as sound. The ancient Sanskrit texts describe specific frequencies that facilitate access to higher consciousness. These frequencies cluster around 110 to 120 Hz. Whether the ancient Sanskrit scholars had access to modern measurement tools or derived this knowledge through centuries of careful observation and experimentation, we cannot definitively say. But the consistency is striking. Multiple ancient cultures, separated by geography and language, identified the same frequency range as spiritually significant. The frequency that modern neuroscience now confirms produces measurable changes in brain activity. The biological implications extend beyond the brain. 110 Hz vibration affects the vagus nerve, the longest nerve in the human body, running from the brain down through the chest and into the abdomen. The vagus nerve controls many autonomic functions: heart rate, digestion, immune response, emotional regulation. When the vagus nerve is stimulated at frequencies like 110 Hz, it triggers what's called parasympathetic activation. The body shifts from a stress state sympathetic nervous system dominance to a relaxation state. Heart rate slows, digestion improves, the immune system upregulates. The person experiences calm, clarity, reduced anxiety. This is the vagal tone, and 110 Hz frequencies naturally optimize it. An ancient builder who understood these principles, whether through empirical observation across generations or through inherited knowledge, would have recognized the profound value of creating acoustic chambers tuned to this frequency. Such chambers wouldn't just be religious spaces, they would be healing spaces. A person suffering from anxiety could spend time in a 110 Hz chamber and experience measurable physiological improvement. A person seeking clarity for difficult decisions could enter the chamber and access enhanced intuitive processing. A culture could use these spaces as healing temples, as centers for meditation and spiritual development, as places where consciousness could be deliberately shifted toward states valued in their society. The evidence suggests, though, we must remain cautious about definitive claims that ancient builders knew this. They understood that certain frequencies produced specific effects on human consciousness and physiology. They built their most important sacred structures to embody these frequencies. They encoded the knowledge into proportions that could be observed and replicated without written language. They created a system that would persist, intact and functional, even after the knowledge of its purpose had been forgotten. The chambers would still work. The frequencies would still shift human consciousness. The healing would still occur. Long after the builders were gone, their gift would remain. But if ancient builders possessed such sophisticated knowledge, if they understood acoustic engineering, if they created chambers that reliably produced healing states and altered consciousness, then why don't we see this knowledge everywhere in the archaeological record? Why did it fade? Why did later generations lose what earlier generations clearly understood? The answer lies not in conspiracy, not in suppression, but in the simple, tragic way that knowledge disappears across human history. It isn't destroyed from the outside. It erodes from within. Consider the history of Roman concrete. The Romans built structures with a concrete formula that proved so durable that some of their buildings still stand 2,000 years later, intact and stronger than the original, having been exposed to earthquakes, floods, and countless environmental stresses. Their concrete didn't corrode. It actually improved over time. The formula incorporated volcanic ash, limestone, and specific mineral ratios that created a self-healing material. Modern engineers studying Roman concrete have found it superior in many ways to contemporary concrete formulas. Yet this knowledge disappeared. After the fall of Rome, the formula was forgotten. Medieval and Renaissance builders couldn't match Roman concrete quality. It wasn't until the 19th century, using modern chemistry, that engineers rediscovered how to create concrete similar to what the Romans had mastered. Knowledge that had worked perfectly for thousands of years, knowledge that improved structures across an entire civilization, knowledge that was applied in thousands of locations across the Roman Empire, all of it lost. The same pattern appears with Damascus steel. Medieval Damascus steel blades possessed legendary properties. They were harder than contemporary European steel, more flexible, resistant to breaking. Warriors across the world desired Damascus steel weapons. The material commanded premium prices. Cities built their reputations on Damascus steel production. And then, gradually, the knowledge faded. By the 1700s, the exact formula had been lost. The specific ore sources disappeared or were exhausted. The precise tempering techniques, once passed master to apprentice in direct training, became fragmented. Modern metallurgists have attempted to recreate Damascus steel using various formulas, and while they've produced excellent steel, they haven't exactly replicated what medieval craftsmakers created. A technology that sustained an entire industry, that defined the quality standards for centuries, that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of materials science, all of it forgotten. Not destroyed. Forgotten. Gothic cathedral construction provides another example. Medieval builders created structures of breathtaking architectural sophistication. The flying buttress, ribbed vault, pointed arch. These innovations allowed walls to rise higher, to reach toward the heavens with architectural elegance that subsequent centuries struggled to replicate. The knowledge of how to calculate load distribution, how to achieve the precise angles necessary for structural stability at extreme heights, how to coordinate teams across years of construction, this knowledge was preserved in specialized guilds. Master masons trained apprentices who trained other apprentices. The knowledge passed directly from hand to hand. Yet when the Black Death swept through Europe in the 1340s and 1350s, it killed approximately half the population. Master craftspeople died, apprentices untrained, the transmission chains broke. Some knowledge survived, preserved in guilds that recovered and rebuilt. But much was lost. The later Gothic period shows decline in precision, in the daring of the designs. Not because later architects were less talented, but because the full knowledge base had been disrupted. Knowledge doesn't persist automatically. It requires transmission. It requires living, breathing people who understand it completely, who can communicate it to the next generation, who can ensure the knowledge doesn't degrade or fragment in the transfer. If that transmission breaks through plague, through war, through economic collapse, through simple generational gaps where training opportunities are disrupted, the knowledge doesn't just slowly fade. It collapses. One generation has the knowledge. The next generation learns from the first, but doesn't gain the full understanding. The generation after that learns from the second, but receives an even more incomplete picture. By the third or fourth generation, what remains is form without function. People still build according to the template, but they don't understand why the proportions matter. They still maintain the practice, but they don't grasp the underlying principles. Eventually, they stop building at all, or they build badly, and then even the form is lost. This pattern appears in the archaeological record at multiple sites with acoustic chambers. The oldest structures show the most acoustic precision. Measurements of chamber proportions, acoustic testing of resonance properties. These reveal that the earliest builders achieved remarkable accuracy. Moving forward in time, later structures show similar design, but with decreasing precision. The proportions are approximate rather than exact. The materials are chosen somewhat randomly rather than with clear specification. By the time of later periods, many cultures appear to have lost the practice entirely, building structures for other purposes, forgetting the acoustic principles that earlier generations had perfected. In Egypt specifically, pyramid acoustic properties show this decline pattern clearly. The Great Pyramid, built around 2560 BCE, shows acoustic chambers tuned with remarkable precision to 110 Hz. The king's chamber's dimensions appear calculated to achieve specific acoustic effects. The proportions follow mathematical relationships that modern analysis reveals as intentional. Moving forward through Egyptian history, later pyramids show similar general structures, but with compromised acoustic properties. The New Kingdom pyramids, built over 1,000 years later, show designs that retained the basic form but lost the acoustic precision. The builders were replicating what they observed from earlier pyramids, but without understanding the underlying principles that made the earlier structures work so effectively. The knowledge erosion likely followed predictable lines. The oldest generation of builders understood the complete principle. They knew why chambers needed specific proportions. They understood the relationship between size, material, and acoustic frequency. They could calculate these relationships and teach them to apprentices. Some apprentices learned well and preserved the knowledge faithfully. But not all. Some missed crucial elements. Some learned the technique but not the principle. Some learned the form but not the function. As these partially trained builders became masters and trained their own apprentices, the knowledge became increasingly fragmented. The fragmentation accelerated with each generation. By the time 5 or 6 generations had passed, what remained was practice detached from principle. People knew to build chambers in certain proportions, but they couldn't explain why. They copied earlier designs, but they couldn't innovate or adapt. And eventually, as societies changed, as building purposes shifted, as the cultural valuation of these acoustic spaces declined, the practice itself was abandoned. The integration of written language into this pattern complicates matters. Many ancient cultures did keep written records, but writing itself can obscure knowledge. A builder learns acoustic engineering primarily through experience, standing in completed chambers, measuring their properties, building practice chambers, refining designs through trial and error. This direct sensory learning is how the knowledge is internalized. Written descriptions of acoustic principles, even accurate descriptions, don't convey the felt sense of what the knowledge means. A student reading, "The chamber should have proportions in the ratio 1.618 to 1, doesn't grasp this, the same way a student who has built multiple chambers with that ratio understands it. Reading that water should flow at X cubic meters per hour beneath the acoustic chamber isn't the same as observing the flow, hearing the effect, understanding viscerally how the water and sound interact. Knowledge preserved primarily in written form tends to become abstract, disconnected from its practical context. This degradation of transmitted knowledge doesn't require evil intention or deliberate suppression. It requires only normal human limitation, generational transition, and the inherent difficulty of transmitting sophisticated technical knowledge across time. It requires only that master craftspeople age, that training periods be disrupted, that economic conditions change, that cultural priorities shift. The knowledge disappears not through burning or destruction, but through the simple fact that knowledge, unlike stone, doesn't preserve itself. Knowledge requires living custodians. When those custodians fail to appear or fail to transmit completely, the knowledge dies. So now, step back and consider the larger picture. All of the evidence we've traced across 8 parts converges on something both humble and profound. The 110 Hz frequency appears globally. The proportions repeat across continents. The architectural sophistication declines over time. The knowledge fades predictably, according to patterns we see in other lost technologies. The integration of water and sound suggests coordinated design. The biological effects match ancient cultural practices. The knowledge doesn't disappear through conspiracy or suppression. It disappears through the simple, tragic way that knowledge always disappears when transmission breaks. What emerges is a picture of ancient builders who understood something crucial about the intersection of physics and consciousness. They built it into stone. And then, across millennia, the knowledge gradually faded, leaving us with structures that still work perfectly, even though we'd forgotten why they work. But here's what this understanding demands of us: a reconsideration of how we think about history itself. Because if the evidence points toward inherited knowledge, if multiple ancient cultures really did receive their architectural and acoustic principles from some earlier source, then the history of civilization isn't a simple story of progress from primitive to advanced. It's more complicated. It's cyclical. It involves knowledge accumulating, then being lost, then being partially recovered. It involves civilizations rising with sophisticated understanding, then declining, leaving fragments that later peoples try to reconstruct. It involves the possibility that we're not the first to reach high levels of sophistication. It involves the sobering recognition that knowledge doesn't automatically persist. It requires custodians. It requires transmission. It requires people who understand it completely and can teach it faithfully to the next generation. The implications reshape how we think about our current moment. We like to believe we're uniquely advanced. We have technology that previous generations couldn't imagine. We have the internet, digital communication, preserved knowledge available instantly. Surely we've solved the knowledge transmission problem. Yet modern knowledge loss occurs constantly. The skills required to repair mechanical objects fade as devices become more disposable. The ability to grow food, to preserve food without refrigeration, to navigate without instruments, these skills vanish as they become unnecessary in urban environments. The knowledge exists in books and on the internet, theoretically available, yet functionally lost because people don't learn it, don't practice it, don't transmit it to their children. Knowledge doesn't persist through availability. It persists through use, practice, and deliberate transmission. The ancient builders understood something else we're only rediscovering: that knowledge worth preserving should be encoded into physical form, into stone, into geometry that can be observed and measured, into proportions that can be replicated without written language. They built their understanding directly into the structures. The knowledge survived in the stones themselves, even after the explanations were forgotten. A modern builder standing in the king's chamber could measure the dimensions and rediscover the acoustic principles without any written instruction. The chamber itself is the textbook. The proportions are the curriculum. The experience inside the chamber is the lesson. This level of wisdom encoding knowledge into form itself, rather than relying on language, represents sophisticated understanding of how knowledge persists across time. Consider what this means for us. If we wanted to preserve crucial knowledge for future generations, knowledge we consider essential, how would we do it? Writing degrades. Languages change. Digital storage requires devices that become obsolete. But geometry persists. Proportions can be observed and measured across centuries. A structure built according to specific mathematical relationships carries those relationships forward regardless of what language later inhabitants speak. The ancients seemed to understand this. They built their most important knowledge into stone, into proportions, into structures that would function according to their design even when the purpose had been forgotten. And yet we face knowledge loss in our own time. How to grow food in soil, how to forage, how to predict weather through observation, how to work with stone and wood by hand, how to preserve and store food without modern technology. These skills are fading not because they're worthless, but because they're unnecessary in developed nations. In a crisis, a collapse of technology, of infrastructure, of the supply chains we depend on, we'd suddenly need these skills desperately. And many would be gone, lost to the same slow erosion we've traced in ancient civilizations. The master doesn't train an apprentice. The apprentice moves to the city. The knowledge dies with the aging master. The next generation is born into a world where the knowledge doesn't exist. They can't miss what they never knew existed. The pattern we see in ancient acoustic chambers, in Roman concrete, in Damascus steel, this same pattern threatens modern knowledge. We have more written documentation than any society in history. Yet we also have greater complexity and greater dependency on specialized knowledge. The person who understands how to repair smartphones doesn't understand how to grow crops. The person who grows crops doesn't understand electrical systems. The compartmentalization of knowledge creates vulnerability. If the specialists fail to train new specialists, if the transmission breaks anywhere in the chain, the knowledge collapses. We've fragmented knowledge so thoroughly that no single person could reconstruct civilization from scratch. We depend on transmission across specialized communities, and transmission can always fail. The ancient builders, by encoding their knowledge into the physical proportions of their structures, created a form of knowledge transmission that transcended language, transcended writing, transcended all the normal vectors of knowledge decay. Anyone who could measure could potentially understand. Anyone with geometry could potentially replicate. The structure itself preserved the message. This is perhaps the deepest insight offered by the ancient acoustic chambers. Knowledge worth preserving should be built into the physical world, encoded into proportions, embedded into structure, created in forms that persist independent of whether anyone remembers the original purpose. We began this journey with a vibration, a simple sensation standing in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid and feeling 110 hertz hum through your chest. That vibration connected us across centuries. It carried us through Malta, through Peru, through Japan, through civilizations that supposedly never contacted each other. We traced the frequency through measurements and mathematics. We examined the architecture that makes such precision possible. We explored the biological effects on human consciousness. We understood how knowledge fades, not through suppression, but through the simple erosion of transmission across generations. Now, as we reach the end of this exploration, we arrive at a choice, not a choice about what to believe, but a choice about how we relate to what ancient builders left behind. The stones are still singing at 110 hertz. The king's chamber still hums at exactly that frequency today, just as it did 4,500 years ago. The oracle chamber in Malta still amplifies voices according to the same acoustic principles that governed it 5,000 years ago. Chavin de Huantar still resonates at 110 hertz beneath the Peruvian highlands. The frequencies don't fade, the geometry doesn't degrade, the effect persists, waiting for anyone curious enough to step inside and listen. This is the gift the ancient builders left us. Not written words that could be lost or mistranslated, not technology that requires electricity or maintenance, but physical spaces that work identically today as they did in ages past. Chambers that still shift human consciousness towards states of clarity, creativity, and calm. Structures that still teach, if we're willing to learn. The evidence we've traced across 9 parts converges on something both humble and profound. Ancient builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of acoustic engineering. They understood the relationship between geometry, frequency, and human consciousness. They built this knowledge into stone across multiple continents. They created systems that integrated water and sound. They encoded proportions that would resonate for millennia. They did all of this not for monuments to their egos, but because they understood something essential. Knowledge worth preserving should be built into the world itself, not written on paper that burns, not transmitted only through language that changes, but embedded into structures that persist, that function, that teach by their very existence. Whether this knowledge was discovered independently in multiple places, whether it was transmitted through trade routes we haven't traced, or whether it came from a source older than any civilization we recognize, the evidence remains clear. Someone understood. Someone built. Someone ensured their understanding would outlast everything else. And we, having lost much of that understanding through the normal processes of knowledge erosion, are slowly rediscovering what the stones have preserved. The process of rediscovery is humbling. It requires recognizing that sophisticated knowledge isn't unique to modern times. It requires accepting that civilizations before ours possessed understanding we've lost. It requires humility about our own trajectory. Will our knowledge persist? Will future generations recover what we know? Or will they find our technologies obsolete, our knowledge fragmented, our understanding lost to time? The immediate takeaway is simple. The ancient acoustic chambers still work. They still produce effects on human consciousness, measurable through modern neuroscience. They still heal. They still clarify. They still shift awareness toward states that people across cultures have valued spiritually. You don't need to understand the physics to experience the effect. You don't need to believe any particular theory about how the knowledge originated. You just need to stand in the space and allow yourself to feel it, the vibration, the shift, the profound calm that comes when the human nervous system resonates at frequencies the ancients seem to understand perfectly. The implications for our current moment are significant. We face knowledge loss despite unprecedented access to information. We compartmentalize understanding so thoroughly that no single person understands how civilization functions. We depend on transmission across specialized communities. If transmission fails, if specialists fail to train new specialists, entire domains of knowledge could collapse. We've fragmented what the ancients integrated. They understood their knowledge as unified, that water systems, acoustic properties, astronomical alignments, and human consciousness were all aspects of a single integrated whole. We've separated these domains into distinct disciplines. Whether we regain that integration depends on whether we choose to learn from what ancient builders left us. The call to action isn't theoretical. It's practical and urgent. The sealed chambers still exist. Giza's mysteries continue to unfold through modern technologies like muon imaging. The underground water systems at multiple sites await systematic study. The acoustic properties of hundreds of ancient structures have yet to be measured. Researchers could systematically explore these sites. Governments could fund acoustic archaeology. Universities could establish programs focused on understanding how ancient builders achieved their sophistication. We could listen, literally and metaphorically, to what the stones are trying to teach. We have the technology. We have the knowledge. What we need is will, the recognition that the past offers lessons the present desperately needs. Beyond the academic and archaeological implications lies something more personal. You can visit these spaces. You can stand where ancients stood. You can experience directly what 110 Hz does to your consciousness. You can feel the vibration in your chest and understand, not intellectually, but somatically, what the ancient builders had understood. You can allow your nervous system to resonate at frequencies that shift your awareness toward states of profound calm and clarity. This isn't exotic or occult or mystical. It's physics applied to human physiology. It's engineering that works. It's a gift left behind by people who understood something essential and built it into stone so it would persist. It persists still. Now, the journey of rediscovery continues. Each measurement adds to the picture. Each acoustic test reveals more sophistication. Each analysis of proportions confirms the intentionality of ancient builders. Each person who stands in a 110 Hz chamber and experiences the effect becomes part of a growing recognition. We were wrong about the past. Not wrong about every detail, but wrong about the fundamental narrative. Not primitive rising to complexity. Not ignorance gradually becoming knowledge, but rather sophistication that faded. Knowledge that eroded. Wisdom that persisted in stone, even when it faded from memory. The task now is to listen, to measure, to understand, to honor what our ancestors left, to protect these spaces so they continue to teach, to ensure that knowledge worth preserving, whether ancient or modern, finds its way into forms that will endure. This documentary journey ends where it began, with you standing inside the king's chamber. The frequency registers at precisely 110 Hz. The vibration settles in your ribs. Your nervous system begins to shift. Your awareness expands. And in that expanded state, you understand something the ancients knew perfectly. We are part of a cosmos that resonates. We vibrate at frequencies that connect us to water and stone and light and time. We resonate with frequencies that ancient builders recognized and encoded into structures. That knowledge didn't die. It was preserved. It persists. It waits for us to listen. The stones remember. Will we? Thank you for taking this journey with us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing your mind to expand beyond the comfortable narratives we usually accept about the past. The questions we've explored together about inherited knowledge, about acoustic engineering, about the integration of water and sound, about consciousness and frequency, these questions matter. They challenge how we understand history. They inspire us to preserve knowledge in our own time. They remind us that we might not be as advanced as we believe. And that's not a threat. It's an invitation. An invitation to learn from what has endured. An invitation to listen to what the stones are still singing. Our next exploration will take us deeper. We'll examine other frequency phenomena at ancient sites. We'll trace water systems across continents. We'll investigate acoustic anomalies that don't yet fit our current understanding. We'll continue asking the questions that make us uncomfortable, that push us beyond accepted narratives, that honor the sophistication of ancient builders. We'll return to mysteries that still wait for answers. So if you've found yourself pulled toward these mysteries, if these questions resonate with you, subscribe. Follow along as we continue this journey of rediscovery. Share this exploration with others who wonder, who question, who sense that history is more profound and complex than we've been taught. Together, we're remembering what the stones have preserved. Together, we're listening to frequencies that have been singing for millennia. Together, we're honoring the wisdom that endured. The stones are still singing. And we're finally learning to hear. Thank you. Until next time, keep listening. Keep wondering. Keep questioning.